There are games that end when the final out is recorded. And then there are games that end differently, games that don't really end at all, but instead explode into something that nobody on the field, nobody in the dugout, and nobody in the stands could have predicted when they arrived at the ballpark that afternoon. Games that get replayed not in highlight packages, but in conversations. In locker rooms. In front offices. In the kind of quiet, serious meetings that happen behind closed doors the morning after something has gone very, very wrong. What happened between the Los Angeles Angels and Shohei Ohtani was one of those moments. It didn't build slowly. It didn't give anyone time to prepare. It arrived the way the most explosive moments in baseball always do, suddenly, completely, and with a force that left everyone standing on the field frozen in place, trying to process what they had just witnessed. 2 Angels players. 1 ambush. And a confrontation between Shohei Ohtani and his former team that nobody in the history of this rivalry will forget anytime soon. The field had barely settled from the 3rd inning when the first signal appeared. Not a pitch. Not a hit. A look. A word exchanged too close to the baseline. A moment that, to a casual observer, might have seemed like routine baseball friction. But to anyone who understood the history, the complicated, layered, deeply personal history, between Ohtani and the Angels organization, it was anything but routine. It was the beginning of something that was always going to happen eventually. To understand what erupted on that field, you first have to understand what came before it. Shohei Ohtani did not simply leave the Angels. He departed from an organization that had been his home, his proving ground, and, in the most honest telling of the story, a place that had both elevated him and failed him simultaneously. The years in Anaheim were not wasted years. They were formative years. They were the years that turned a generational talent into a generational phenomenon. But they were also years marked by losing. By organizational dysfunction. By the particular pain of being the best player on a team that could not build around him, could not give him the one thing that every great player ultimately chases above statistics and awards and individual accolades. A chance to win. When Ohtani signed with the Dodgers, the decision was not made lightly. Those close to him described a process that was thorough, emotionally careful, and ultimately centered on a single, clear conviction: he had given everything he had to the Angels, and it was time to take that everything somewhere it could become a championship. The Angels, for their part, handled the departure publicly with grace. Press releases were professional. Statements were respectful. The proper words were said in the proper order. But underneath those proper words, in the clubhouse, in the front office, in the conversations that happen between players when the cameras are off, the departure left marks. Some players understood it. Some admired it. And some, it turns out, never fully processed it. Those players were still in Anaheim. And now Ohtani was coming back. The at-bat itself was unremarkable by Ohtani standards. He had already made his presence felt earlier in the game, the kind of quiet, inevitable dominance that has become his signature, that makes opposing pitchers and coaches stare at their data and wonder why none of it ever seems to fully account for him. But it was what happened after the at-bat that changed everything. As Ohtani moved along the baseline, words were exchanged. Not the casual, performative trash talk that happens dozens of times in every baseball game and is forgotten before the inning ends. These were different words. Pointed words. Words that carried the specific weight of people who know each other, who have shared a locker room and a training staff and years of professional proximity, and have things that have never been properly said. The first Angels player moved in from the left side. Not a collision, something more deliberate than that. A positioning. A crowding. The kind of physical proximity that sends a message without technically crossing a line, that forces a reaction while maintaining the veneer of accident. Ohtani's reaction was not what they expected. He did not step back. He did not defer. He did not reach for the composure that he is so famous for, the unshakable calm that has made him the subject of as much psychological study as physical admiration. Instead, he turned. And in the turning, something that had been carefully contained for a very long time came loose. The second Angels player was already moving. Whether it was coordinated, a genuine ambush, as those who witnessed it from the dugout later described, or whether it was the spontaneous combustion of accumulated tension, the result was the same. Within seconds, what had begun as a baseline dispute had become something that both benches were rising for. The field, in that moment, was no longer a baseball field. It was a reckoning. There is a specific sound that a baseball stadium makes when both benches empty. It is not the sound of the crowd, though the crowd is always part of it. It is not the sound of cleats on dirt or the sharp commands of coaches trying to restore order. It is something underneath all of that, a collective intake of breath, a sudden shift in atmospheric pressure, as 20,000 people simultaneously realize that what they are watching is no longer a game. Players poured onto the field from both dugouts. Coaches moved with the controlled urgency of people who have been in these situations before and know that the first priority is not justice, it is separation. Security personnel, who had been watching a baseball game moments earlier, were now navigating a crowd of athletes operating on pure adrenaline. At the center of all of it was Ohtani. He was not backing down. That was the detail that struck every witness, coaches, players, reporters watching from the press box, with the most force. Because Ohtani, in his public presentation, is a figure of extraordinary composure. He smiles at the right moments. He defers when deference is appropriate. He carries the weight of being perhaps the most scrutinized athlete on the planet with a lightness that seems almost impossible. But in that moment, standing in the middle of a field that had turned into a battlefield, he was not performing composure. He was done performing anything. Whatever had been building, the history, the departure, the years of complicated feelings that neither side had ever fully articulated, had found its way to the surface. And it had done so in the most public way imaginable. Both teams were eventually separated. Order, in the technical sense, was restored. But order and calm are not the same thing. And the dugouts that followed the confrontation were anything but calm. In the Angels' dugout, players who had initially surged forward stood in smaller clusters, speaking quietly. Some of them had known Ohtani well. Had eaten meals with him. Had sat next to him in team meetings and watched him prepare with a focus that made everyone around him feel simultaneously inspired and inadequate. Whatever they had expected from this reunion, and every player on the Angels roster had thought about it, because how could they not, it was not this. In the Dodgers dugout, the reaction was different in texture but equal in intensity. These were players who had built something with Ohtani over the past year. Who had watched him move through a Dodger clubhouse with the same quiet, relentless professionalism he had brought to every environment he had ever entered. They had seen his preparation. They had seen his routine. They had come to understand that underneath the global icon and the unprecedented statistical achievements, there was simply a competitor, one of the most ferocious competitors any of them had ever played alongside. What they saw on the field was confirmation of something they had suspected but never quite seen so clearly: when pushed to his absolute limit, Ohtani pushes back. Manager Dave Roberts, standing at the top of the dugout steps, watched everything unfold with the controlled expression of someone doing several calculations simultaneously. The competitive calculation: how does this affect the game? The personnel calculation: are any of my players injured? The organizational calculation: what does this moment mean, and how do we respond to it publicly? He would face the press conference later. But first, he had a dugout to manage. Sources close to the Angels clubhouse, speaking in the hours after the game, offered a picture that was more complicated than the simple narrative of aggression. The players involved, the two who had moved on Ohtani in what witnesses described as a coordinated approach, were not acting out of pure anger. Or rather, anger was present, but it was not the only thing present. Underneath it was something that the Angels organization had never quite been able to process publicly: the feeling of having been left behind. Professional athletes understand, intellectually, that free agency is a business. They understand that players make decisions based on opportunity and money in competitive circumstance, and that those decisions are not personal. They say this to reporters. They say it to each other. They say it in the measured, practiced language of people who have been media trained since their early 20s. But understanding something intellectually and feeling it are two entirely different experiences. For players who had stayed in Anaheim, who had believed, season after season, that the right pieces would eventually come together, that the losing would eventually stop, that they would eventually get their championship moment, watching Ohtani leave for a team that immediately became a World Series contender carried a specific kind of sting. It was not that they blamed him. Not exactly. It was more complicated than blame. It was the feeling of standing in a place that you have given years of your life to, watching someone else make a choice you were never able to make, and wondering, in the quiet moments, in the honest moments, what that says about you and the choices you made. Those feelings don't disappear just because a press release says all the right things. They live in the body. They surface at unexpected moments. And sometimes, when the person at the center of all those feelings walks onto your field in a different uniform, they surface in ways that were never planned and cannot be taken back. For Ohtani, the confrontation marks something significant, not in the way that sports headlines will frame it, not as a controversy or a scandal or a moment of lost composure, but as a confirmation. He is no longer a guest in his former home. He is an opponent. A rival. And rivals, in baseball, are not treated with the careful deference that is extended to departing legends. They are tested. They are challenged. They are, on occasion, ambushed at the baseline by players who have things they need to say and no other available language for saying them. The fact that Ohtani did not retreat, that he stood his ground on a field that used to be his and looked the people who challenged him directly in the eye, will not be lost on those who were watching. Not on his teammates. Not on the Angels players who were watching from a distance. Not on the scouts and analysts and executives who study every dimension of his performance. He came back to Anaheim as a Dodger. He left it as something more, a player who has fully, finally, and completely moved on, not by pretending the past didn't happen, but by facing it directly when it came for him. Baseball rivalries are built from moments like this. Not from statistics. Not from standings. Not from the carefully composed narratives that teams and leagues construct around matchups to sell tickets and generate television ratings. They are built from the raw, human, unscripted collisions between people who have history, who have something at stake that goes beyond the game itself. The Angels and the Dodgers share a city and a complicated relationship with that city. But what happened on that field introduced a new layer to their rivalry, a personal one, with Ohtani at its center, that will define every future meeting between these two teams for years to come. Every at-bat will carry an echo of this moment. Every look across the diamond will carry its weight. Every game between these organizations will be colored, at least slightly, by the memory of the day that two Angels players moved on Ohtani and Ohtani did not move away. The field has been set. The lines have been drawn. And in Los Angeles, in both Los Angeles, they are already counting the days until the next meeting. Because in baseball, as in life, the most important moments are never the ones that finish cleanly. They are the ones that leave something unresolved. Something burning. Something that demands, eventually, a next chapter.